All right. Okay, thank you, Jim, Anthony, and William. Did you guys really enjoy that? Yeah? Okay, give another hand of applause. Okay, so we're trying to stay on time because we've got a bunch more other speakers as well. For our next speaker, it's actually right before we introduce Lawrence here, I'm going to just share one thing with you. So earlier I gave you guys a technical definition of what Bitcoin and blockchain is. So I wanted to just give you more, for those of you who are a little bit more newer to this technology, more of an analogy of what this is. So do you guys remember what life was like before we had email? Anyone remember? We'd write letters and we'd send, it'd take 2 weeks before your grandmother would get your letter, and then it would be very expensive and time consuming, right? It was very analog. So essentially what happened is the internet came about, and there's this technology called SMTP, which is essentially this open source code base that exists on the internet that no company or government or person controls or bank. It's just this code base. And companies like Google and Gmail have built on top of it to enable frictionless communication. So Bitcoin is essentially a technology that allows frictionless value transfer between one another. But before Bitcoin came about, there was something that many of us have heard about called Mintchip. By a show of hands, how many people have heard of Mintchip before? Many people. Okay, great. So I know this was a big inspiration for a lot of us before we heard about Bitcoin. And so today we have the CEO of NanoPay, and so Lawrence is going to talk a little bit about their initiative and share some of his thoughts on this topic. So please welcome Lawrence.
So in the spirit of disruption, I was asked to disrupt blockchain a bit. So forgive me if I go a little astray from the typical blockchain agenda. So the first thing is I'm going to show you a quick little video. Then I'm going to talk about why we actually need banks and central banks. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Mintchip for those who are not familiar. Then I'm going to do a little bit of blockchain versus Mintchip versus Bitcoin and some thoughts there. And then I'm going to talk about an innovation agenda in Canada. So I think I have to switch here. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but I was shown this by my 12-year-old.
No. What about the Fed?
They announced another round of the quantitative easing.
What does that mean?
It means they are going to make large asset purchases via PAMO.
What does that mean?
It means they are going to expand their balance sheet and buy treasuries.
What does that mean?
It means they are going to print a ton of money.
So why do they call it the quantitative easing? Why don't they just call it the printing money?
Because the printing money is the last refuge of failed economic empires and banana republics, and the Fed doesn't want to admit this is their only idea.
So why do they want to print the money?
Because they say we have the deflation, and the deflation is very bad.
What is the deflation?
The deflation is when prices of the things we buy go down.
Isn't it good? Doesn't it mean the people can buy more of the stuff?
Yes, but the Fed said this is bad, especially during the recession.
So they think that during the recession, when the people have less money to buy the stuff, it is bad that the prices go down?
Yes, the Fed would rather have the inflation.
So why does the Fed think we have the deflation?
Because the CPI said so.
But aren't the food prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the gas prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the healthcare costs higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't tuition prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the taxes higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the subway fares higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the stock prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the bond prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
So what is deflating right now?
The only thing deflating that I can see is the Fed's credibility.
Did they have a lot of credibility to start with?
No.
Why not?
Because the Fed has been wrong about every major economic development in the past 20 years.
You mean they didn't see the internet stock bubble?
No. In fact, they helped fuel the internet.
Okay, so I think you get the point. It's a pretty funny view on quantitative easing, and if you go online, you'll see lots of these. They're fantastic. But the truth is, we actually do need the central banks, and we do need the banks. And I'm just going to spend a couple of seconds on why. So the first thing is banks. Why do we need banks? Well, let's think about this. Who's got a Bitcoin or a blockchain company here? Okay, and you pay all of your guys in Bitcoin, right? None of you get paid in dollars. All right? Okay, so at some point, you've got to buy some things in dollars, so you've got to convert your Bitcoin into dollars. And how do you do that? You go through an exchange. And what does the exchange use? Well, it uses a bank account. Otherwise, you're not going to get the money to someone. So even Bitcoin companies and blockchain companies need banks. But the most important reason why we need banks is because banks lend. Banks take deposits and banks lend. And we trust banks. Why do we trust banks? Because the government backs them, right? So that instead of losing $150 million when a Bitcoin investment goes down, the government says, oh, that's naughty. A whole bunch of people go to jail. You get your money back. They reverse all the payments, even though it was immutable. It doesn't matter. Some people can get their money back, right? So that's why we trust banks, because we don't lose our homes and our businesses because we make an investment, right? So we can trust the banks. The real reason we need a bank is because banks actually create money. And not only do they create money for themselves, which they do, I must admit, but banks also create money for everyone else. Because there's not $100 in the bank for every $100 that are under deposit. There's a ratio, and it's like 10 to 1. So there's 10 times as much money in the whole ecosystem every time you put money into the bank. And without that, none of us would actually have enough money. None of us would get mortgages, none of us would own homes, and the whole system wouldn't work. So could we throw out all the banks and say banks are terrible, banks are dinosaurs, banks are bad, and could we move to a Bitcoin world and have Bitcoin and no banks? I'm sorry, we couldn't. Wouldn't work. As desirable as it is for some, it is actually a value transfer from banks to blockchain entrepreneurs. And I'm sure that they will also want to extract rent in some way, shape, or form, although that's unidentified. Do we need central banks? Absolutely. We need central banks because of price stability, right? We've got to maintain price stability. What if we'd gone through the crisis that we went through and everyone is in Bitcoin? What do you think would have happened then? There would have actually been financial collapse. The whole planet would have gone under. It would have been civil war. It would have been Syria right here in Canada and everywhere else. We actually do need central banks. And I'm not saying central banks are perfect. I'm not saying they're brilliant. And I'm not saying they haven't made mistakes. They absolutely have made mistakes. But they're at least acting in the right general direction. Now here, a lot of people from Bitcoin say, but we've got inflation built in, and inflation is much better in a Bitcoin world than it is with a central bank deciding what it should be. But the truth is that you want to be able to have some sort of control of what your inflation is, because you need growth. And there are a couple of economists out there that say that you don't need growth and inflation is not required. But the truth is, every time there's a bit of growth, you put that money in the bank, it then gets multiplied, then other people get money, and there's a knock-on effect. And that's why our salaries can keep going up. That's why we can earn more money. That's why our economies keep growing. And economies that have no growth from their population because they don't have immigrants or their birth rates are low, all struggle with growth. This happened in Japan, right? And you need central banks to help us through that process. We're okay here in Canada. We get lots of immigrants. Like myself, I'm an immigrant, came from South Africa. But ultimately, we do need the central banks. And a really important component of this is a lender of last resort to the banks, right? And the regulation thereof. Well, I'm getting a 5-minute warning already. So I'm just going to skip over this next thing. I'm not going to tell you about that. I'll tell you a little bit about digital cash. So digital cash is different from cryptocurrency in that it actually is a digital representation of something that exists in the physical world. So it's fiat currency. And the advantage of digital cash is that it doesn't go up or down, so there's less risk on the actual underlying currency. And the advantage of digital currency over, say, cash is you can send it electronically. It has all the same benefits that a cryptocurrency would have, except it's denominated in the fiat currency. And there's legislation in Europe that allows you to do this. We're working on legislation in Canada. It's a little bit behind, but they look at the European legislation. So you can get an e-money license in Europe to do digital cash. So it is different. The technologies are very similar, but the actual use case is fundamentally different. A little bit about Mintchip and NanoPay. So we acquired the technology from the Royal Canadian Mint. The Royal Canadian Mint had focused only on one use case of the Mintchip technology, which is a direct asset value transfer system. And their use case was digital cash. We think the use cases are way broader than that, and actually what we're doing is selling our infrastructure to banks who will not be using it in the digital cash infrastructure. They'll be ripping out their 25-year-old technology and replacing it with things like Mintchip, which can do transactions significantly faster and significantly cheaper. So yes, we're also live in digital cash. We've really done that as a proof of concept. And Mintchip is available today. You can go to Liberty Village and you can buy your food and have your nails done and buy flowers. And it's pretty cool. I would encourage you to download the app and try it. We wanted to get 500 users. We got about 3,000 in the first hour. And this is just to do a little small commercial test. You can do P2P nationally, and it's all free, right? Now, a little bit on the technologies. So I think this is from a 1964 book on networks. And there's centralized model, and we all agree that that is not the most perfect model on the planet. And then there's the decentralized model, which is kind of a combination of the two. And then there's a true distributed network. And I believe, and I know a lot of people are not going to like this, that Bitcoin is actually the middle one. It's decentralized. It's not really distributed. And that's because not all of the participants in the ecosystem hold the nodes. Not everyone's holding a copy of the blockchain. And third-party wallets are holding your keys and your environment, and therefore it is actually essentially decentralized rather than distributed. If every party in the ecosystem had their own blockchain, then it would truly be a distributed network. So it's actually not a perfect example of how you could do a network. Ironically, Mintchip is completely distributed. In fact, it's so distributed that you can do an offline transaction, where you can do a transaction between two parties that are not online. Okay? So very, very powerful. The way we've implemented it at the moment, most of the secure asset stores which hold value in our environment are held in the cloud, but they could actually be held anywhere, including on offline environments. So let's say we're going to assess a payment system. There's cost. Well, my math on cost on Bitcoin is it costs about $7 per transaction. And the way I got this is I add up all the total costs of buying the mining, doing all of the transaction, all the total costs throughout the industry divided by the number of transactions that are done. Answer, $7 per transaction. That doesn't sound like a very cheap ecosystem to me. It's actually pretty expensive. Sure, it's free to the end user, but hey, so's e-money transfer with RBC. It doesn't mean it costs nothing to do that. And $7 per transaction is quite a high cost. Speed. How long does it take to do a Bitcoin transaction? About 10 minutes, right? How long does it take to do a Mintchip transaction? 30 milliseconds. Which one do you think's quicker? Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Security, they both use the same security structures. We don't use the same method of comparing the algorithms, but comparing the blockchains, but they basically both use the same security. Settlement is real time in Mintchip. Governance, we have a governance structure and it fits within a regulatory environment and is owned by someone. So there is a throat to choke. If something goes wrong, you can go after someone and someone will go and can go to jail. And we've seen that with Bitcoin, but in the Bitcoin world, they get nasty about it. They arrive with rifles and they throw some guys that maybe didn't even do such bad stuff in jail. And then there's a standard, and I think this is a really key thing. Everyone keeps comparing it with the internet and with voice over IP, and those are really standards. And there is a standard for payments today, and it's called ISO. It already exists. All of the bank applications use it. All big businesses use it. So all the invoicing systems on the planet use it. So the answer is ISO is the standard. Australia built a new faster payments network. It's built on ISO. Okay, I'm getting 1 minute. And then regulation. Well, I think regulation is coming and it's coming fast. So last little point is, I think while we have more in common than different to blockchain and Bitcoin, and I've spent most of my time separating us, I think our agendas are still the same. And our agenda should be to make Canada the center of excellence in fintech. And we have a great opportunity because the UK screwed up their opportunity. They were definitely hands down the center of excellence until they did the Brexit thing. Now everyone's too scared to go anywhere near them. And let's face it, no regulator in the UK saying, come on into us, we're a nice little island. It's going to become the United Kingdom of England and the Falklands. I don't know, everyone else is going to leave. It's going to be a tiny little place. No one's going to want to do their company out of there. And then a regulatory sandbox. And I think a regulatory sandbox is absolutely key because For a bank to work with a new fintech startup, whether you're in Bitcoin or whether you're in our business, they need to know that it's safe for them to do that. And at the moment, banks are shit scared of doing everything. And they're shit scared. Why? Because they get whacked with a big stick by the regulator all the time. They get ridiculous fines, particularly in the US, and they get in trouble all the time. So we need a regulatory sandbox that says it's okay to play with these companies, and we want to tell the banks, the regulatory sandbox is not for the companies. It's actually for the banks to play with the companies. So we want to create this environment where we are net importers of ideas, net importers of developers into Canada to develop a fintech environment. And then I think the last thing, and I think this is a really key thing, is all of the fintech companies in the US and all of the Bitcoin companies in the US said, banks are shit, banks are dinosaurs, we're going to crush them. And you can't, because they've got all the customers. And as much as the customers hate them, the customers still trust them, right? In Europe, they've gone about it another way. And what's actually happened in Europe is most of the fintech companies have tried to collaborate with banks, and the regulator has been the big bad guy. And the regulators have said, you banks are too big, you banks are too bad. You have to play nicely with these guys. So now we've got PSD2, where you have to give an API to your bank to get in. Now all the fintechs are saying, fantastic, I'll use that API and I can do account to account. So I think the real answer is actually to collaborate with banks and work with them. Create the right regulatory environment to do that, rather than run around and tell them we're going to eat their lunch because they're old, right? Because it's really difficult to say a bank is shit and then turn up at the local branch and try and open an account so that you can pay your employees, right? So I think the key thing here is we've got a huge opportunity, but it's through collaboration. Now, the last thing is revolution. A lot of Bitcoin guys want to create a revolution. When was the last successful revolution? The French Revolution, when was that? Brexit was a revolution. No, not quite. And it hasn't played out yet, right? So the Arab Spring was a disaster. Everyone is worse off since the Arab Spring. So we go back in time. When was help me with the dates here. When was the US Revolution? 1755? So around there, that was a successful revolution. And after that, I think the French Revolution was successful. They've had 5 republics since, but the revolution was, I don't know, 1790-something. Thank you, 1789. Thank you. I've got a Frenchman in the audience, obviously. So I think the French Revolution was the last successful revolution. So I think the best way to do a revolution is from within rather than from the outside. You can't take on banks and infrastructure and central banks and the ecosystem from the outside. You need to work with the banks and do it from the inside out. Last thing on finance. Sorry, I'm closing now. Last thing on finance. We had to go out of Canada to get our finance. So we think we had an easier story to tell investors, and we ran around Canada and we spoke to lots of people. We met with Jim Orlando once. We actually got our funding from the US. We got it from Goldman Sachs. We've taken $10 million to date. I think we've got a pretty cool story. And I would encourage you to go and get your money in the States. It's easier. It's just one flight away. They're much more open-minded about a whole bunch of stuff. Thank you for your time.
One of the things we wanted to do with these meetups is we wanted to start bringing out opposing views. A lot of the times at a lot of these events and meetups, we have people kind of talking only about the positives about Bitcoin and blockchain. But you'll see some of the speakers today we're bringing on intentionally to challenge some of these ideas that we're kind of comfortable with, right? So the next speaker we have is actually, her name is Hillary, and she is the founder. Actually, just give me 1 second. Hello, that's my little one. Hola. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna have Hillary Carter. She's gonna talk about diversity in blockchain. And yeah, we're running a few minutes behind schedule, so I'm gonna just get her up here right now.
Thanks, Sunny. Oh, Sunny, the clicker. Here we go. Okay, hi. Tonight I want to talk to you about 3 things. I want to talk to you about the gender gap that exists in the blockchain ecosystem and why it's really important that we all work together to try to close it. Secondly, I want to illustrate some of the things that women bring to their organizations that are correlated with success, particularly with respect to the establishment of trust. And finally, I want to discuss ways we can all work together to bring about change. First of all, some disclaimers. I'm not here to criticize the industry, and I'm not here to advocate for a quota. but I am here to encourage more participation by women in this industry. And while I wholeheartedly agree with Gandhi's belief that the real advancement of women can only begin by way of their own efforts, I believe that this statement doesn't quite address the issues that women face every single day. The fact is that women with equal qualifications to men still face tremendous gender stereotypes and biases that keep them from contributing to society in an equal way, and they keep them from earning equal pay for their work. At the same time, my own introduction into the blockchain ecosystem has been overwhelmingly positive. I found that the leadership is open and accessible and engaging. And in fact, my very first Bitcoin was given to me in a one-on-one demonstration by Andreas Antonopoulos, and that took place right here in this room. I think this industry is filled with amazing people who have really big ideas, and I actually want to see it succeed. And I think that if we all work together to address some of the issues, we can be more successful in the process. One of the projects I'm really excited about is the Social Wallet. Social Wallet is a not-for-profit corporation founded by Kyle Kemper, and Kyle's the reason I'm here tonight. Kyle and I have been working on a social media and communication strategy for the Social Wallet's upcoming fundraising campaign. And Kyle's been incredibly open and receptive to some of the perspectives and the ideas that I've brought to the table. And sometimes when I give him a gender-based perspective, he says, "I'm picking up what you're laying down." So he's been great to work with, and I really want to thank him for the opportunity. The Social Wallet aims to bring financial inclusion and a digital identity to all people, and I think it's a really inspiring project. One of the things I'm also inspired about the blockchain is the possibility to positively impact the lives of people right here at home. In the United States, there are 88 million people without a bank account. And what's more egregious is that in addition to not having access to financial services, financial institutions in Canada and the United States are sitting on $50 billion in unclaimed property that has stemmed from dormant accounts. And they make little or no attempt to repatriate that property to the rightful owners. But should you miss a $30 Visa payment, they will know exactly where to find you. And the Social Wallet aims to change the system as we know it and to provide finance in a friendlier way, to give more people access to credit and to financial services. We're in a race to market, there's no question about it, and we need your support. So I'm going to ask you if you could all stay tuned and follow us on social media and support us on our journey to bring this really important application to market. In March, media theorist Don Tapscott tweeted his hypothesis that if more women were in the blockchain ecosystem, it would lead to better collaboration, I wanted to make sure I had his words right, better collaboration and more sensible governance. I happen to think he's a visionary, and I agree wholeheartedly with his hypothesis, and I particularly like his choice of word, sensible governance. In May, Don Tapscott published the book Blockchain Revolution with his son Alex Tapscott, who's a Bitcoin expert in his own right. I have read this book twice, and if you're new to the space, I highly recommend it. It's an incredible message on how this technology has the possibility to disrupt and transform many aspects of our business world and the private sector as well. In Blockchain Revolution, the Tapscotts fully acknowledge that the blockchain ecosystem is overpopulated with men. And they do dedicate several chapters to highlighting some of the amazing work that women are doing in this space. Particularly Imogen Heap, who is working on, she's a Grammy-winning musician. She won a Grammy for producing. And she's developing a blockchain application that will enable artists to be fairly compensated. So if you haven't bought the book, go out and buy it. Love it. In July, my most recent column was published in the Globe and Mail, highlighting the fact that I believe the blockchain ecosystem was ripe for women's leadership. And I wrote the column hoping that it would inspire more participation by women, perhaps introducing them to the concept for the very first time. I'm particularly excited about the technology's possibilities as they relate to female stakeholders. the face of poverty in the world is a woman's, and women and children are mostly disadvantaged from access to financial services and access to digital identity or any kind of identity. So what exactly does the gender gap look like in this space? Last month, Cointelegraph published an article whereby they describe Bitcoin as a man's world. And that's because 2% of the Bitcoin community is male. And in fact, 96% of Bitcoin users are men. So not only do we have a gender gap in terms of the composition of our teams, we have a gap in terms of the users of cryptocurrencies. So the million-dollar question is why? Why do we have this gap? And quite honestly, we have a gender gap because we have a skills gap. As a demographic, women and girls had not been socialized to participate in STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math, to the same extent as they've been encouraged to pursue the humanities. And even in situations where women do enroll in a program of study like computer science, many of them drop out before graduation. So there is a problem within the academic community where the needs of female students are not being addressed. So why does the gender gap matter? What's the big deal? Well, quite simply, study after study from Harvard, MIT, and so on have made the positive correlation that diverse teams are positively correlated to corporate outperformance and organizational outperformance. It is not any more complicated than that. When your teams have more women on them, they outperform. And what is it that women specifically bring to the table? Kirsten Stewart, who's the first head of Twitter Canada, argues in her book that women have unique attributes that lend themselves to organizational outperformance, particularly the ability to inspire and motivate others, to communicate passionately, and to collaborate in ways that help build trust. And let's be honest, the blockchain has a trust problem. Whether it's the hack on the DAO or the hack on cryptocurrency exchanges, or the fact that the technology is unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, linked to extortion and money laundering and pornography and all kinds of other illicit activities, there's reputational damage, and we need to change the narrative, and we need to have a positive story accordingly. There have been occasions where women's attributes have been used for advancing radical movements. And if the blockchain is a radical movement, it needs more women on board. The Bhutan movement in India was successful in having land transferred to people who previously had none. They had to include women on their teams in order to access certain villages where women were segregated, and they couldn't have women to information meetings if there were no other women present. This was a successful movement because it had diverse teams. It succeeded in transferring 50 million acres of land to people who previously had none. So if blockchain is radical, we need to get creative in how we compose our teams and the kinds of strategies we can use. I think Malala says it best, that there's a generation of women in the world over who refuse to accept the status quo. She says, "We will not accept a world where decisions about our future are made in rooms girls cannot enter." And gender segregation is alive and well today because of marginalizing policies that limit women's access to education, and as a result, illiteracy flourishes. There's another example I want to conclude with where women's skills and attributes have been used to advance radical movements. In 1963, on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Martin Luther King was set to deliver his oration for civil rights in the United States. His original speech did not include the words, "I have a dream." His handlers and advisors did not believe that those words would be remembered on this occasion. But about halfway through his speech, Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer who was on stage with Martin Luther King Jr., called out from behind him during a pause and said, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." It was at this point that Martin Luther King Jr. abandoned his notes and improvised what has come to be known as the "I Have a Dream" speech. It was one woman's prompt to encourage him to speak passionately and purposefully and from his heart. Because if we're going to change people's minds, we actually have to capture their hearts in the process. I'd be remiss in not paying homage to some of the incredible leaders in the blockchain space who are featured in this slide, and this is by no means all of them. I'm really happy to see some of them right here in this room. Amber Scott, Jenna Pilgrim. I don't see Ileana. Ileana, if you're here. No, but she's amazing. Rubik's by Deloitte. These women are pioneers, and they're doing great work in the industry, and I hope they'll continue to mentor other young women who want to walk in their shoes. So to conclude, we really do need leadership to address this issue, and I'm going to ask 3 things of all of us today. The first is to socialize our daughters, to nurture their curiosity in STEM industries, to encourage them to pursue rocketry and robotics and all kinds of math and science, and tell them why their participation in those spaces is really important. The second thing I'm going to ask everyone to do is invite a woman to a meetup. Encourage her to go to a book launch or send her an article that you've read in the paper that you think she might find interesting. And thirdly, to hire a woman on your team, to appoint a woman onto your board and to harness the unique perspectives that she brings to the community. It's my hope that the promise of the blockchain will be fulfilled, and I truly believe that if we address the gender gap issue, that we'll be much more successful in doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. That was awesome. I'm a big fan of women. So I wanted to say a big thank you to my wife, Carolina, and then Tracy. She's been helping out all day. And as we've heard today, right, like the Bitcoin world, the blockchain world, it's like carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders when you're in this space. It's really difficult because, you've got everyone against you. So we started these meetups back in India, I told you guys, a few years ago, and in our first meetup we had 3 people. It was me, my wife, and a friend of mine. And so today we have, maybe 3,000 people in our different meetups around the world. So big thank you to all the wives out there actually supporting us, because we only do like a little bit of it, right? Okay, so I wanted to bring out our next speaker. He's a good friend of mine. His name is Matthew. He's the CEO of Nuco. From what I heard, he was the guy who got Deloitte into blockchain. So without any further ado, let's welcome Matt.
I'll join you, Sunny. I'm a lover of women, so appreciated the comment. So hi everyone, my name is Matthew Spoke. Thanks, Sunny, for the introduction. Really happy to be here today. Really happy to see how fast this movement is growing. The fact that we're here. I mean, the last time we were in this room for one of these meetups, as Anthony said earlier, was last year. But this community in Toronto kind of never ceases to amaze how quickly people come together, how passionate this community is. I've spent the majority of the last 2 years kind of making it my life mission to bring this message of Bitcoin, the message of the blockchain, the message of Ethereum to the corporate world that I came from. And for a while it hadn't yet landed on their radar. And as Sunny mentioned, that was my purpose when I worked at Deloitte. Recently, I left that corporate world. I left my role at Deloitte, and I co-founded a new venture called Nuco. You can check out our landing page. I don't have a slide behind me, but nuco.io if you get a chance. And before you ask, if you stumble on our website, you'll notice that our logo is a little weird. It is a platypus. I won't explain to you why it's a platypus. If you ever feel like finding out why, you can come talk to us. So tonight I thought I'd take some time to share with you kind of my own personal ambition, my own personal reason for being in this space, the vision that guides us at Nuco, and I'll briefly talk to you about what we're working on, and finally the high expectations that we have for Toronto and for Canada. We're all here because we share a common interest, and for some of us, it's a common purpose. And in one way or another, in some form, we all share this desire to change the world for the better. And right now, it happens to be through this function, this concept of the blockchain that we think will have kind of an enormous impact on the future. And that's why these events are so important. I think it's fascinating to see the collection of people that are in this room. The fact that in this same room, there's people representing the largest banks in the country just as much as there are kind of local hacker groups. And you don't often find this kind of collection of people coming together on one concept. And there's not a lot of examples in history about kind of the organic growth of a social movement like this around a technology. You don't often see people getting excited about something that could be described as really boring and menial as lines of code that do something a little bit differently. But in similar rooms to this one around the world, there are tens of thousands of people that share this purpose, that share this interest, and that really want to see the future of this technology flourish. And although as a community we're terrible at this, Anthony was mentioning it earlier, we often look for reasons to kind of find differences between us. You know, I'm a Bitcoin guy, I'm an Ethereum guy, I'm a public blockchain guy, a private blockchain guy, I'm corporate or I'm community. And I mean, it's all kind of nonsense because I think it's worth remembering that we're all here for the same common desire for positive change. And whether that's the social wallet or, you know, unlocking inefficiencies in banking because it can give banks access to reaching untouched populations that didn't previously have access to. And that should really be the driving force that unites us as a community. We're at the very beginning of a new industry, a new social movement, and a new technology. And most excitingly, we're the ones that are building it. I mean, it shouldn't be understated that a single person acting in this space today can have an enormous impact. Everybody joining the blockchain space today has an opportunity to really be a pioneer. I mean, Hillary was mentioning some of the women in this space. I've worked very closely with Ileana. We started this process together at Deloitte. And 2 years ago, it sounded crazy to step into a space that we knew nothing about and establish ourselves as thought leaders. And Ileana is a great example of someone who really has done that for herself. So as I mentioned, I mean, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Nuco. We're a company that truly believes that we're going to change the world. And along with others like us, the reason we think we can is because we have a steadfast focus on change. We don't accept the status quo. We don't accept the mediocre returns on the potential that technology, previous iterations of revolutionary technologies have promised us. So instead of waiting on the sidelines and waiting for the world to change, we decided to jump in and to change the world. And we all know, as we constantly hear from innovators and entrepreneurs in this space, that there is an abundance of opportunity for hundreds of companies to become successful, to find their niches and to unlock value in the blockchain space. And I suspect that I'm not the only one who gets equally excited about this as I do get terrified by the implications of those ambitions. After all, we're not suggesting a faster way to deliver food. We're talking about changing the way that people interact and transact with each other at all levels of society. And I can tell you firsthand, I've been an entrepreneur now for 2 months after having spent 5 years in a really cushy and comfortable job, that it's really easy to become dissuaded and discouraged when you stop to think about the size of your ambitions. But then you also stop to think about the size of your team and the size of your bank account and the size of your competition. So what is it that drives us at Nuco? What is it that allows us to go after global enterprise-sized problems with a small local startup-sized team? Well, simply put, it's a vision. And it's a difference on how we measure success, and it's a difference on how we measure impact. I think in some cases, having the large financial reach of a large organization, be it the one that I came from or other large organizations that are actively investing in this space, can obviously help. But as most of us know, especially if you come from the Bitcoin space, that world-changing vision often requires the ability to see through short-term volatility, dips in reputation. And this is something that the large corporate world has a really hard time with. I mean, I come from a background of large established businesses. I spent 5 years at Deloitte, as I mentioned. I think it's critical that this domain continue to attract these large established businesses. I'm thrilled to see that IBM is here tonight to talk about their offerings, but I think it's more critical that we as entrepreneurs and innovators realize that the real change is in the hands of this community, the hands of these individuals. The future of blockchain technology will be determined by groups like this, not by large corporate boardrooms around the world. It's going to be a mixture of commercial interests and collaborative groups that work to solve complex problems. And the scope of these problems shouldn't be underestimated. Anthony was making reference to some of the problems plaguing the Ethereum and Bitcoin space today, none of which are simple problems to solve. Now, we at Nuco see the inefficiencies of large businesses as an opportunity. We envision a future where people get to the services they need from the companies they trust. We're not here to throw out the banks, as somebody mentioned earlier. But we think that it's in the best interest of people to get to those services without the mountain of reasons that we have today to get frustrated and disconnected from the companies that usually serve us. In everything that we do, our vision is to connect the world. To move in that direction, Nuco is building enterprise blockchain software. I liked the way that William put it earlier. I think he phrased it quite well. You can go to Home Depot and learn how to build furniture, or you can go to IKEA and have a package delivered for you that's really easy to assemble. And that's probably a good way to sum up what we're doing at Nuco. So we're offering solutions to large companies to allow them to figure out how to become part of the solution rather than staying part of the problem. We're building a framework to distribute and decentralize processes. If there's an unnecessary friction in a transaction, if there's an unnecessary redundancy in information, that's where we step in. That's where we provide solutions for these large organizations to envision their corporate processes, their transaction processes, the way they connect with their employees or their customers. Now, after 2 short months since founding, we're very excited to be moving at full speed. We recently hired 5 engineers to join our team. That brings our team to a tremendous 10 people that we're very pleased with, and we're moving quickly to get to know each other and to act fast in this space. And we're expecting to be going through another growth phase pretty soon. We're also looking to connect with passionate and talented people, and that's why we're here. So if you think what we're doing is interesting, if you share an interest in this space and you want to come talk to us, we'd be thrilled to talk to you. And we're also very interested in connecting with passionate and purpose-driven companies. I think some of the biggest challenges that are going to be solved in this space are going to come from collaboration, not single companies working on their own to go and unlock commercial interests, but groups of companies that really find a purpose and a reason to work together. And some of these world's best companies can and are located right here in Toronto. And we have some of them here in this room with us tonight. Earlier this month, Nuco was fortunate enough to be accepted into a leading Silicon Valley-based accelerator, which we're unbelievably proud to be a part of. But when we were asked to move to the Valley for this accelerator, we told them that we were deciding instead to plant our roots here in Toronto, to hire here, to grow here, to have a team here, and to simply use the Valley as a satellite office so that we can meet American companies and investors. Now, why didn't we move? Why didn't we go down to the kind of shiny destination of Silicon Valley? Because as many people have said before us, we're equally committed to the growth of a strong Toronto ecosystem. We think there's an opportunity for Toronto to stand out among its peers. And personally, I think it's great the fact that we have successes to point at, but I'm also kind of bored of hearing of the origins of Ethereum and the fact that we have a couple of big-named authors from Toronto. We need more. Those are great starts for this city, but we need more risk takers, and we need more thought leaders. We need more innovators, and we need more startups. Because it only takes a few to start down a path towards an irreversible trend. And I think that's a necessary ambition for this city and for this country. I mean, a simple example, when I was still at Deloitte, he probably doesn't remember this, but I met Joseph Weinberg from Paycase 18 months ago. And Joseph had a very simple vision to change something in the world that he didn't think was right. And he was doing it. He built Paycase, and that's what they're on their way to do. And I saw a guy with a vision, and that was enough to inspire kind of a boring old corporate guy to start rethinking the way I viewed problems. And I won't fully credit Joe for this new company because he might come ask me for some equity. But these are the types of unintended consequences that happen from communities like this. There's a network effect at play when you concentrate a group of disruptors that share a passion for something. And the beauty is that you might not even realize that you're doing it. You know, in 1955, there was a brand new company called Shockley Semiconductors that launched its operations in, back then, the Apricot Valley of Palo Alto, California. And Shockley was doing something nobody else was doing. Shockley was building the world's first silicon-based semiconductors, the disruptive technology from their era. And that was the first of many companies to follow that became a wave of new companies that established what we know today as the Silicon Valley. Similarly, I'd like to invite companies and entrepreneurs in this room, in this city, to join us as we commit our company, Nuco, to be part of this blockchain wave in Toronto. A wave of companies that will share in the purpose of changing the world, companies that will help establish Toronto and Canada as the place to be if you want to lead. Often, as Canadians and as Canadian companies, we become our own biggest limiting factor. We don't allow our ambitions to be as big and bold as our counterparts. We automatically discount our ability to succeed on a global scale. Well, forgive my language, but that's bullshit. And now we have to do something about it. And only the people in this room can do something about it. And if you ever find yourself questioning your ability to make an impact, consider this. The Wright brothers were among the least funded, least educated, and smallest teams in the early 1900s trying to solve human flight. They were surrounded by news of so-called leaders in their field who are likely going to reach their objective first. That said, they weren't focused on those teams. They weren't focused on the established train or boat manufacturers that could have easily put investments into airplanes. Yet they're the names that you remember. They're the fathers of flight. And why? Because they believed more than anybody else that their vision was the one that was going to change the world. That's all I wanted to share with you tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, even though I'm from IBM, I'm not here to sell you anything. So that should be a good thing, right? So I think the good thing about going last is everybody else before me has already talked about some of the challenges with existing systems, some of the deficiencies with evolving blockchains, let's call it that. We're all familiar with some of the issues that have happened either with the DAO or with Bitcoin. To the best of my recollection, there were 4 scenarios where transactions had to be rolled back with Bitcoin itself. There was the infamous $160 million hack that happened in 2010. I mean, turns out that was a integer overflow problem, a programmer, obviously, somewhere. There was another one where it was like another few $1 million and so on and so forth. We obviously had that hack at the DAO. So what does IBM have to do with any of this? So 2009 is when I was part of an internal study to try and figure out what are the upcoming technologies. So much like all large organizations, IBM has a small group dedicated to just that, figuring out what's the next big thing. So we looked at it, we put together a point of view, and then our leaders we decided, not the right time. Well, guess what? About April or the May timeframe last year, they finally decided that if IBM as a company has to stay relevant and stay alive for another 100 years, blockchain is something that we really want to do. When that happened, so then we started scurrying around to see what intellectual capital already exists. One of our key aims was we did not want to write anything new. We did not want to rebuild something. We don't want to impose or inflict any other pain onto our users about here's new IBM software or a shiny new toy that you buy. So we started looking at the landscape to see what already exists. And that's when we realized that what exists did not, at least in our mind, meet the needs of enterprise customers, whether it's around Ethereum, Ripple, or other blockchain implementations, Bitcoin obviously being the most famous one. There were issues around whether it's transaction commitment time, transaction finality. I mean, in Bitcoin world, even though I might offend some Bitcoin purists, a transaction is never really committed. Right? I mean, there is always a risk that somebody with a much longer chain than yours can come in and say, hey, mine's the more valid chain, and then what do? I mean, of course, even with proof of stake or proof of work, there are some limitations on how do you commit a transaction, how you finalize a transaction. There are issues around transaction throughput. So in the case of Bitcoin, as an example, if you are one of the hackers in China, actually, a little bit of sidebar, I built my first Bitcoin mining rig, I think it was 2012. That lasted that lasted a good, I think about a month. I managed to mine half a Bitcoin. And then I thought, okay, you know what, damn, I'm really going to buy another rig. So I started looking. And then there used to be a website called Silk Route, and they had these Bitcoin processors available, which are publicly available now, by the way. They used to do, at that time, it was they used to do these in multiple gigabytes. I mean, of course, now you have terahertz hash machines available. But the funny thing was, it's a Bitcoin machine that accepts payments in Bitcoin. So I thought that was, a self-feeding cycle right there. Anyway, coming back to this, so we started looking at, okay, is there something that we can repurpose and rebuild and sell it? Or maybe build some value-add services on top of that from IBM? After much heartbreak and much turmoil, we realized that there was nothing that existed. So like all good software companies, we decided to build our own. I started this talk by saying I'm not going to sell you anything. So, here comes the snake oil salesman. I'm a technical guy, I promise. So by and by, we had a bunch of developers working on it. And then somebody had a bright idea. Why don't we just donate it to the open source community? So at this point, we were about 44,000 odd lines of code. So this was about the holiday season last year where we reached the the Linux Foundation. And we thought they might not actually accept us. They might already have had these projects going on. So when we reached out to them, their president actually started laughing. Apparently, we were the 11th company to reach out to them, but the only one that they actually took seriously. So we donated, along with IBM work and Blythe Masters, we donated a bunch of code to this open foundation, so it's all available public. There is no IP, there is no, I mean, it's free open source software that you can go to hyperledger.org and download. In addition to IBM, on the day of the founding or the day of the actual formation of the project, there were 30 companies that signed up. I think we're about 65-ish now, more companies getting added. And practically every large name that you see is either in the process of joining or at least evaluating how they should join. So Vitalik Buterin's fans, he was with the steering committee of Hyperledger 3 weeks ago. We're trying to figure out, there are, I think, 3 different possible ways. I mean, if you haven't met Vitalik, the guy's a genius. So he kind of outlined 3 different scenarios how Ethereum and Hyperledger could come together. It may or may not happen, but the point is this. You don't really need to pay anybody a dime to run a blockchain network. What you can do is, as an example, go to hyperledger.org, download the code yourselves, and start playing with it. That's the simplest way of doing it. If you hate running virtual machines and installing, if you're using Mac or if you're using Windows workstations and you hate installing VMs and so on, you can go to Docker Hub. You can download a Hyperledger Docker source code and start running it on your Linux laptop. So some of the things that we started looking at this from an enterprise perspective, and I completely agree that we're not in the business of disintermediating banks. I don't think that the banks are going to disappear. I think the bank's functions may change. So claims processing might change. Risk rating might change. Last week, we formally announced general availability of a supply chain solution on IBM blockchain, which is a fancy way of saying that there is a group within IBM that's called the IBM Global Financing Arm. We process, I can't remember the number, several $100 million of transactions that we do with about 3,000 odd suppliers. So suppliers essentially being our third parties, OEMs, ISVs, business partners. And at any point in time, there is approximately $100 million of revenue that's stuck in dispute. Dispute might simply be, hey, this doesn't have the right part number, doesn't have the right tax code, and so on and so forth. So in the spirit of trying to eat our own cooking, we thought, okay, could we use blockchain and all the promises that it does, could we use to expedite this claims processing? So $100 million, typical duration that a claim would take was about 180 odd days, something like that. So we're now seeing with this shared ledger in our closed ecosystem, in this closed network, we are seeing dispute resolutions down to several days or a few days. So there is tremendous improvement. So obviously we're trying to prove the validity of the premise that this might actually work. At CES, the Consumer Electronics Show last year, we introduced a project that if you Google Samsung Adept or IBM Samsung Adept, which essentially was marrying the blockchain world with Internet of Things world. So the idea is, although I hate this concept, but the idea is that you could have automated intelligent machines that can do business for you, so you don't have to be involved. I mean, that's one more way of my wife telling me that I'm useless. My wife's a technology fan as well. So as an example, those of you who own Tesla or those of you follow Tesla, so Tesla introduced last year, there was a feature called Summon. So what it does, because of regulation, not because of any limitations of technology, what it does is, if you summon your car and you're standing in the driveway, the car will talk to your garage door opener, open the garage door reverse, and be where you are. Well, how useful is that? But what they're trying to do is, the technology exists today where if you're in San Francisco, the car's in New York, and you summon the car will come, well, obviously open the garage door, come out of the garage. And then what it'll do is, along the way, it'll stop and fuel itself and pay for itself. Now that's the more interesting bit. Guess what? There are now technologies, well, outside of Tesla, there is a startup in Germany that does that. So back to CES, what we demonstrated is a washer, a Samsung washer dryer, essentially acting on its own. So it's doing banal things such as it detects that detergent level is low, and then it talks to the marketplace of detergent providers in that blockchain and orders detergent. Well, I mean, if you sit back, it looks like a pretty simple idea, but if you sit back and think about it, the device, first of all, has to enter a marketplace. It has to identify who it is. It has to validate the provenance, that it's indeed my dishwasher and not yours. Right? And then order the right part. It's not just a dishwasher. Order the right part, make sure that it's the dishwasher tablet for the right dishwasher and not somebody else's. has to be your preference. You want the blue colored tablet and not the green colored one as an example, so on and so forth. It's doing all of this without your intervention. Anyway, so the point behind all of these and these simple examples is you'll find use cases for blockchain in industries and technologies that you may have not even may not even thought about. One of my favorite ones that came about while I was talking to the government of Canada, without spilling any state secrets, is apparently there is a Canada Heritage arm of the Canadian government that gives out grants, that's my 5-minute warning, that gives out grants to musicians. So apparently, sometime, somewhere, the Canadian government cut a check to Justin Bieber, which I think is just absolute travesty. But what these guys do is they keep track of the rights for a certain piece of art for a given artist. So if you think of the art ecosystem, you have the artist, the studio, the contributors, the distributors. It might get sold to some network in the US or anywhere else in the world for that matter. They might own, like if Spotify buys it, they might own a different set of rights on it that, so many plays, they get a certain amount of money, so on and so forth. And they're trying to figure out how do you store these rights in a fashion that, first of all, your rights are being stored on an off-chain record, so to speak, or an off-chain database, so to speak. But you keep track of your actual rights as to, who owns them and when they started, when they terminated, who bought them, who sold them, so on and so forth. Keep all that. Obviously, blockchain might be a good fit for that. So these are some of the examples that we're looking at. Final couple of words that I wanted to mention on the blockchain architecture. We firmly believe that rather than trying to build your own fabric, it makes sense to join the open source world. World such as here. There are a lot more developers, a lot much more scrutiny of the code that happens in the open world. At the same time, when blockchain gets built or the blockchain networks get built, you want those networks to be private. I swear to God, that's the only enterprise world that I'm going to talk about, that yes, private blockchains have a place to exist. We can have a sidebar or a few beers or whatever else you might like, just to discuss that and the validity of that. So that exists. So what we are doing is there is the open source fabric that currently exists that you can reuse, as I mentioned, from those sources. What we also provide on top of that is additional capabilities, all open source, things such as identity services. So I, as a business user or an individual, have to be recognized or I have to register with a authority registrar that this is who I am. And then for each transaction, I should have some limits of what I can hide and what I can show. And obviously, there has to be a non-validating peer that can see everything. So that could be the regulator. See everything within limits again, obviously. We also provide things such as pluggable consensus capabilities, which I think is pretty unique. When I say we, I mean the open source we, not the IBM. So the pluggable consensus here is that if PBFT doesn't work, and we have I think 2 implementations, third one in the works right now. If PBFT is not your poison, then you can go and get another implementation of that, like a Civ as an example, or anything else that you would like. And then final point that we're seeing is, you need, 2 final points. One, you need some DevOps capabilities around it. So you need a mechanism, 2 minutes. So you need a mechanism around this blockchain in order to be able to write the code, test the code, scale, do some scale testing, do some bug testing, deploy the code, roll back the code, so on and so forth. So we provide a whole bunch of DevOps capabilities around it. And then finally, regardless of which blockchain you use, the world will, in my opinion, will emerge to a place where interchain communication has to happen. So you might have a chain running Ripple, another chain running Ethereum, another chain running whatever, Hyperledger, whatever else. They will have to talk to each other. So there has to be a mechanism where those different silos can then talk to each other. So is that I don't want to call it a blockchain of blockchains, but certainly you need some interoperability between the blockchains. Anyway, go to hyperledger.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I know everyone's super tired and probably hungry, so I'm going to let you go. But I want to just finish up with a couple of things. So you probably heard this quote before, right? So first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. So I think blockchain is kind of at that stage. Well, it depends on when you walked into the presentation. If you came in during Lawrence's talk, we're probably at the the third line there. But one thing I wanted to share with you guys is that, so one of the things I walked away with today is that it's not about disrupting banks or governments. I think what's happening is a parallel system is being built that's going to make current systems more efficient. And just like how the post office still exists, even in a world where we have email, we think that these systems will all coexist. Second last thing I wanted to share is that I shared this at our last meetup. I think entrepreneurship is a lot like eating glass and staring into the abyss. That's Elon Musk's famous quote. So don't get the notion that this stuff that we're talking about is easy. It's super, super hard, but it's also very, very rewarding. And the last quote that I wanted to share with is that success matters, failure is inconsequential. So it's okay to fail, just keep trying. All right, so thank you all for coming out. We do have a sponsorship package out, so if you're part of like a large corporation like IBM, etc., and you're looking to sponsor our events, we'd be more than happy to work with you. Thank you all.